Welcome, everyone. So thank you for joining us. This is a bit of a new format for us, which you can think of as an adaptation of our standard speaker series. And my daughter's walking in. Not right. That's my daughter, Sammy. So we're doing it, but we're doing it from home. Which is, of course, where we've all found ourselves these past few months. One of the advantages of doing this remotely, of course, is that we were able to bring together people from all over the company. So we have, because of the way the time zones worked out, people from everywhere from the West Coast to Eastern Europe. And we're really excited to have you all with us today. Given the international scope of the team on this call, I think it's fitting that we are joined today by Richard Haass, who for the past 18 years has been president of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. As many of you know, some of you may not, the Council is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to advancing the conversation about foreign policy. Among its functions, it's a think tank, a publisher, educational institution, and its membership comprises more than 5,000 of the world's most esteemed government officials and thinkers and individuals, business people, and it's often led the conversation on the global stage. Before Richard took the reins at CFR, he was director of policy planning for the Department of State, where he was principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell from 2001 to 2003. He was also special assistant to President George H.W. Bush from 1989 to 1993. We're actually just talking about, I've always thought H.W. was very much an underrated foreign policy president, and senior director for Near East and South Asian affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. In 1991, he received the Presidential Citizens Medal for his contributions to the development and articulation of U.S. policy during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He's also served in the Departments of State and Defense, legislative aide in the U.S. Senate, faculty member of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and at Hamilton College. And given all of that, I don't think it would surprise any of you to know that he was also a Rhodes Scholar. In his spare time, Richard writes books, and a lot of them. He's written 11 books and edited 4 more. His latest book is The World, A Brief Introduction, which was published in May and has received really great reviews from people like Doris Kearns Goodwin, who said, I think his narrative flair, depth and experience and wide-ranging knowledge sparkle on every page, and a number of other people. It's a great book. I would tell you, Richard is one of the few people in the world with the know-how and credibility to write a book called The World and do it thoughtfully and credibly. The great news is you don't have to take my word for it. You all have copies of the book, and I encourage you to read it and enjoy it. It's so relevant to so many of the things that affect both our lives and our business today. And it's also just a very fun and interesting read. So for now, Richard has obviously kindly offered to speak to us about the book and about all the things that are going on in the world today. Each of you should have received a Q&A button where you can submit questions. I will give them to Richard, but they will be your questions. And so really want to be able to talk about the things that all of you are interested in, as well as just us. But to start, let me turn it over to Richard. Richard, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for sharing the time and the book with us. And I thought it would be good to start just by talking a little bit about what motivated you to write this book, and who you're hoping to speak to with it, and what you're hoping to get out of it. So let's start there.
Well, thank you, David. It's great to see you, and hope and trust that everyone who's on this can not only hear and see us, but more important, that they are safe and well. I'll talk for a few minutes. Unlike some in Washington, I won't filibuster, but I'll talk a little bit about what led me to write about the book, and I'll segue from there into talking about the real world as opposed to the book called The World. What led to the book was an encounter with a young man about to become a senior at Stanford, computer sciences. And I was struck when I asked him a few questions. It turned out he was going to graduate from Stanford and essentially be unexposed to anything to do with international relations, economics, history, and the like. And when I went back to my office and did some research on it, it turned out he wasn't an exception. That while virtually every 2 and 4 year institution in this country offers any number of courses about international relations, say, virtually none require that students take it as a condition for graduation, and many students don't. So what got me thinking was, wow, if you have this many people coming out of disadvantaged background who aren't literate about the world, and then you've got all the people who don't have the opportunity to go to college or university, then you have all the people who may have gone there back when and forgot what they learned, or what they learned was essentially overtaken by events. If you studied these issues 40 years ago, you studied about the Cold War. And the last I checked, the Soviet Union no longer exists and the Cold War ended 30 years ago. If you watch the nightly news, you're not going to be much wiser about the world for the 30 minutes that you tune in. There's tons of stuff on the internet. Problem is, a lot of it's wrong and it's not done in any systematic or comprehensive way. So I was just struck by the gap between the objective importance of the world, the power and reality of globalization, and how little folks knew about it. And it seemed to me it was dangerous for democracy. We need an informed citizenry. How can people vote on the basis of the stances of the candidates if they're not familiar with the issues or what the candidates think? How can they hold elected officials to account? And in their personal lives, how can they make informed career decisions or business decisions or investment decisions, or personal in terms of health? So for all these reasons, I decided to write a book that was kind of my attempt at one-stop shopping to try to narrow the gap between what I thought people needed to know and what a lot of people did. And what you have hopefully next to your bed is the result. What's so interesting is, since I've written it, what's happened? Well, we've had the coronavirus. And in some ways, this is an expensive lesson of what I was trying to say, because what began in Wuhan didn't stay in Wuhan. It spread around China, in part because of some of the poor decisions of Chinese authorities, in part because of some of the poor decisions of the World Health Organization. Then it came to this country and every other country in the world. And what we see is a dramatic variation in effectiveness in dealing with this virus, from successes to failures. But my larger point, again, is that this is a perfect example of how the world matters and how it has changed people's lives. Again, globalization in this case wasn't the choice. The choice is how we respond to it. And also, when you think about it, this isn't unique. We've had other diseases before. We're going to have other diseases again. This is COVID-19. Well, we may have COVID-20 before the year is done, or COVID-21 next year. 9/11 was about 3,000 people who lost their lives in the United States in a 24-hour period because of people who came from around the Middle East and were trained in Afghanistan. Climate change happens every day, every hour, and it's the sum total of the events all over the world. Cyberspace is essentially this global Wild West with lots of people with guns, but no laws and no sheriffs. And so this to me is our reality. And the argument in the book is really twofold. One is we ignore the world at our peril. If we ignore it, we are the proverbial ostrich putting his set in the sand, and you risk getting washed away by the tide. And second of all, not only do we have to pay attention to the world, but our ability to shape events is multiplied dramatically if we partner with others. So essentially, I have two biases in the book. One is against isolationism and one's against unilateralism. And essentially, my argument is people, citizens of any country, including but not limited to the United States, need to have understanding of the world, need to support and involve foreign policy, and need to think about partnerships, alliances, multilateralism, institutions, because that's the way to have an impact. No single country can defeat a virus, can defeat terrorism, can defeat climate change, or just about anything else. That is essentially the bias of the book. I'd say one other thing before I turn back to David. which is we're at a dangerous point in history right now. It's not just the headlines that are sobering, but let me just suggest, just to fill out the canvas, it's a combination of three things. One is that you've got the return of what I would call a lot of the familiar challenges of history: rising powers, weakening powers, conflicts within countries, disagreements between them. This is the stuff of history. This is nothing new, but we've seen a revival of it, particularly between the United States and Russia, between the United States and China. Great power competition did not go away with the end of the Cold War. It's on the upswing. Secondly, and as I just alluded to, you've got this raft of new problems, essentially derivative of globalization: proliferation, terrorism, climate change, infectious disease, you name it. And essentially, you have all these global phenomena, and the willingness and ability of the world to come together to manage them is inadequate. And there's a large gap. It's true about trade. It's true essentially about every global activity, either natural or man-made. And I'm worried that this gap is large, and this gap, again, between the scale of the challenges and the size of the response and the nature of the response is large and growing. And then thirdly, the United States is critical to all this. After, beginning with World War II, the United States essentially rejected its tradition of isolationism and got heavily involved in World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, fought the war in Europe and Asia. And then after World War II, resisted pressures to turn inward, as was America's tradition, and instead remained actively involved in the world. And this was the stuff of the Truman foreign policy, containment, the Marshall Plan, NATO, standing up the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the alliance system. This was the stuff of the last 75 years. And the way I describe it, you're in the buildings industry. The United States was the architect and the general contractor of the world. We didn't do it by ourselves, but we were the principal architect and we were the principal builder. And what's happened in the last few years, a little bit towards the end of the previous president, Mr. Obama, but it's accelerated dramatically under President Trump, is the United States is essentially elected to no longer perform that role. Essentially, to use a slightly loaded phrase, I would say we have abdicated. And there's no one else who's willing and able to take our place. And like any other system, the world doesn't just organize itself and come together naturally. To the contrary, most of the trends or forces are centrifugal, and we're beginning to see that. So this combination of the revival of traditional problems, the emergence of new ones, and this change in behavior by the country and the world that for 3/4 of a century was most responsible for what order there has been out there, this is a pretty dangerous combination, because what it suggests is a future that is far, far, far more turbulent and dangerous than the recent past. But that is where we are. So it's a sober picture. And I'm not sitting here. I'm prepared to, I can talk about certain things that I find some reasons for optimism about. But the basic arrows, I would say, are essentially pointing in worrisome directions. And for people, whether it's in your personal lives or as a business, I think one's outlook has to be influenced by that. I think we used to have a set of expectations. And my point when I talk to people in the business world is I think our expectations now have to be, and our optimism has to be tempered. And we have to assume that we're going to be conducting our activity in a world of greater turbulence, greater uncertainty, with a possibility of external variables coming in and changing what otherwise looked to be a fairly good trajectory. I think the odds of that happening on a more frequent basis have certainly gone up. So why don't I stop there, David? I don't want to depress people anymore. So, and it's too early for a happy hour, at least in this country. Maybe not in Europe.
We've got most of our time zones are afternoon already. So
oh good. Those martinis can now get stirred or shaken.
It's 10 a.m. here, so I'm not sure I can dig in yet. But no, so it's so interesting. You wrote this book before, obviously, COVID, but if you ever needed an illustration of why, one, leadership, and then, on, at the level of government, and then two, sort of international cooperation was needed. I mean, this is certainly it. In that regard, you talk about this gap, right? The gap between, this gap between sort of the ability of, to coordinate foreign policy and have real statecraft, and where we are today as we've pulled back or abdicated. I guess two related questions, one from Justin Scala and one from Peter Hicks. If we had a new administration in the upcoming election, a Biden administration, what would be the focus areas in terms of rebuilding some of these, multilateral institutions? And I guess I would add a related question of, if we don't, how, and people think Trump, people on the international stage think Trump is not just a 4-year phenomenon, but truly kind of the world as we know it. How might you expect the world to further reorder around us?
I'm not sure I understand. I mean, if Trump is reelected, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, well,
the second question?
Yeah, the second question is, if Trump is reelected,
Okay.
and people decide that it's not a temporary phenomenon, how much reorder?
Okay, let's take the first one first, about if Biden is elected. If Joe Biden becomes the 46th president of the United States, look, he'll be able to choose lots of things. He'll be able to choose his running mate. He'll be able to choose his platform. He'll be able to choose his cabinet. He'll be able to choose his inaugural speech. The only thing he can't choose is what awaits him in the world or in the country. That you inherit. And if he is the 46th president come January, he is going to inherit as bad a hand as any president has inherited in a long time. Internationally, you're going to have everything I just talked about going on. And domestically, he will inherit a country still completely in the throes of an epidemic, of a pandemic. There's no chance it will have abated by the time he comes in. You'll still have tens of millions of people out of work who were not out of work last December. You'll have a country deeply divided, and possibly even more divided than it already is, depending upon whether the election result is accepted widely, or whether it's seen as somehow illegitimate by the losing side. You'll still have issues of race. You'll still have Kennedy Airport and Newark Airport, as bad as they are. K through 12 education is going to be no better than it is. You'll still have tens of millions of Americans who do not have access to adequate health care. Inequality will be what it is. Poverty will be what it is. So it is going to be a tough inheritance, it seems to me. I think a lot of the pressure will be on a new president to focus on our domestic challenges. A lot of people will say, we don't have the luxury of focusing on the world. We got to focus here at home. The problem with that is, as we've learned, is the world doesn't give us a timeout. It doesn't say, yeah, okay, Americans, you go sort yourself out and come back in a few years when you're ready. It doesn't work that way. There's no pause button there. So he doesn't have the luxury of putting the world on hold, but he'll have to deal with the pulls that are inward. I think that what he could do most easily, David, is probably improve America's alliances. Mm-hmm. And that's a big deal because it'll help shore up stability, and allies are our best partners. So if you want to deal with climate or cyberspace or fixing the World Health Organization or any other global challenge, there's no better place to start than with your 24+ allies in Europe, and the Japanese and the Australians and the South Koreans and others. These are your natural partners. So you begin the day with a couple of dozen would-be partners. Mm-hmm. And so that, to me, is the easiest thing to address. Some of that is style, some of that substantive. Where it gets more difficult is actually then agreeing and doing something. So we could all agree, for example, that we want to make some strides on climate change, but actually agreeing on what that should be, the approach, the ambition, assigning responsibilities, and actually seeing it done, very different thing.
Yeah.
And that's true of every issue. And a lot of what he's going to inherit is not enough to simply go back. You can go back into the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement's inadequate.
Mhm.
You can go back into the Iran nuclear deal. The problem is the prohibition against arms transfers to Iran expires this October, and the sunsetting provisions on the nuclear side start kicking in 2025. Not that far off. There is no framework to really walk into on cyber or North Korea and so forth. So you can, I think, again, try to restore certain things, but in many cases, you still need a positive foreign policy. One thing Joe Biden talked about, I think it was yesterday or today, was about TPP, the trade agreement in Asia Pacific. And he, the good news is he's talking about getting into it, but it has to be renegotiated. And that'll mean us and I think it's the 11 will have to agree, but at least that opens up that possibility, which would be good for American exporters, and it potentially puts pressure on China. So what it's going to take is a willingness to work with others, and I think some imaginative foreign policy, because we can't, the world's moved on in the last 4 years. So you can't simply take out a key and unlock things. It's going to actually take a very different foreign policy. I think if it's Donald Trump, in my experience, people of his age don't tend to change dramatically, and people who win elections tend not to change. They tend to think they've just gotten affirmation. They got a mandate.
Mm-hmm.
So I would think a second Trump administration would be pretty recognizable. If anything, there's a doubling down. And I think it could be truly consequential. I'll be neutral in what it does, both to to alliances and to this post-World War II world. But I think it would be pretty unrecognizable. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
If he had 4 more years, you may think that's great. If you like what he's doing, you may think it's awful if you don't like what he's doing. But my hunch is 4 more years would be the 8 years then of Donald Trump would truly be a consequential presidency.
Mm-hmm. Drawing on that, Christian Pohl was asking about, China, and, we do a bunch of business there, as a lot of people do. Do you think China is ready to, if we do pull back more or abdicate more, is ready to fill this gap that the U.S., or do they have too many of their own problems to deal with? And I guess at the same time, it's very much become consensus to it started with Trump, but it's become somewhat consensus on both the right and the left that everybody dislikes China. And so how should we think about China as a regional power, or as a kind of true rival that could fill the gap?
Look, they're both great questions, and they get at 2 of the 3 big debates going on about China. The first is how strong is China? The second is, what is China's ambitions? And the third is, how should we deal with China? I think China has some real challenges in terms of demographics. It's an aging society. It will before long be a shrinking society. The one-child policy turned out to be a disastrous decision. You got real public health challenges long before and apart from COVID. You've got terrible environmental problems. Got a very top-heavy leadership. What we saw with COVID, the problems of reporting bad news up, of self-correction. You've got concerns about, you see what's going on in Hong Kong, you see what's going on with the Uyghurs. This is a very repressive society that sees threats everywhere, and sees threats to the integrity territorially and politically of the country. So I don't think China's got a particularly appealing model to much of the world, to be perfectly honest. I think in terms of its ambitions, I think there are 3 different levels. I think their principal ambition for the leadership is to stay in power, and for them, staying in power means keeping the country together, which means what they're doing in Hong Kong. It means just really coming down hard on any centrifugal forces. Hence, Taiwan is very much in their high on their priority list. They're going to have to do this against the backdrop of lower economic growth. And what concerns me, therefore, is that leads them to slightly expand their ambitions outside. I think some of the nationalism we're seeing could well be a substitute for high levels of economic growth. This is a different way of providing legitimacy for the regime, some building public support. They may also be trying to take advantage of the fact that we and others are distracted. You know, not either or. I don't think China has particularly global ambitions in the way that the Soviet Union did. I think they're more regional and internal. And look, for us, the challenge is how do we push back against parts of Chinese behavior we don't much like? At the same time, we recognize our limits to influence them internally. And we recognize the desirability of certain types of economic interaction. And we recognize the desirability of, say, limited foreign policy cooperation, say, on dealing with North Korea or dealing with climate change, dealing with Afghanistan, what have you. And I think that's the challenge. How can we come up with what I would call it's a pretty deft approach to China, where we push back selectively, yet don't preclude possibilities still of selective cooperation. So far, at least, we're not working that out. And the US-Chinese relationship has clearly lost altitude the last few years. And if Joe Biden is elected, coming back to your previous question, David, I don't think that turns around on a dime. I think there's real differences on trade, if anything, more differences on human rights if Democrats are in power, real differences strategically over things like the South China Sea. So I think this remains a scratchy, extremely scratchy, difficult relationship, no matter what happens this November.
Yeah. So on this question of multilateral and bilateral relations, Ollie Roberts, sort of asked a question which was maybe the opposite of what I was saying at the beginning of, hasn't COVID highlighted the need for international cooperation and asking the question of essentially, in fact, we saw the opposite, right? We saw border shut down, we saw immigration shut down, we saw even the EU, which was, sort of supposed to be one market, kind of hoarding medical supplies domestically, in different regions at certain points. So has COVID maybe had the impact of sort of reversing, bringing back a nationalism or reversing this trend towards globalism more than already was going on?
In some areas, yes. And there's one definite exception and one possible exception. But in many areas, yes. I mean, what we're seeing essentially is each country's been handling it on its own. And some countries have done remarkably well and some have done remarkably poorly. And what's interesting and those who have done well or poorly are all different types of governments. We have democracies doing well and we have democracies doing poorly. We have authoritarian systems doing well and authoritarian systems doing poorly. Turns out it's not the nature of the system that's the critical variable, it's the quality of the leadership. And I'll just leave it at that. You can draw your own conclusions on that. But it is ironic that a manifestation of globalization has led to such national responses. The biggest exception to that has been Europe. Mm-hmm. And you remember, I mean, the COVID crisis came against the backdrop of Brexit. It came against the backdrop of a growing north-south divide in Europe. And what's happened is this has become the catalyst for a revival in Franco-German cooperation.
Yeah, you had the bonds, put out bonds together.
Absolutely. You see the ECB stepping forward. You see the Commission stepping forward. And this was what's, for people as old as I am, what's so interesting about this is this goes back to the roots of the European project, the coal and steel community. And Macron and Merkel have clearly seen this as essential. And I'm intrigued by what's going on. I'm not known for my optimism, as anyone listening to this has already sensed. But this is a very, to me, heartening development, because what you basically see is Europeans saying, okay, we've got to not just respond to this crisis, and they're doing their best impersonation of Jay Powell, but also they understand that simply to have monetary union without fiscal and credit counterparts is inadequate. Yeah. So to me, this could be a really interesting moment in modern Europe. We're not there yet, but at least there's some positive things. Yeah. The other area I'm not sure of is what's the most relevant, which is global health. Mm-hmm. What this shows is that global health arrangements are inadequate. WHO did not, shall we say, cover itself with glory. the world has been supine in the context of the Chinese and having not met its international obligations for weeks. Half the countries in the world have never met the standards set by these things known as the international health regulations. They were set 15 years ago. Now, what this administration has done is, to me, as self-defeating and as ill-advised as it gets, which is to walk away and to defund. But I think I haven't given up that this still could be an occasion. There's two possible outcomes, or three, I guess. One would be that this does lead to some World Health Organization reform. The other is it leads to the standing up of some supplementary or auxiliary set of arrangements. I don't think it gets replaced, but I can imagine almost like when HIV/AIDS really hit the world full force, WHO wasn't up to the challenge, and we created additional mechanisms to help cope with it. And I think it's quite possible that either governments or even non-governmental actors will create some new mechanisms out there to help deal with either the potential or actual outbreaks of infectious disease. I think that's quite possible.
And one more question on sort of this COVID moment right now, from Dan. Are there, you described some of the silver linings, potential silver linings coming out of this. Are there areas of the world where, now that everybody is so focused on dealing with, a very present crisis, are there actors or areas of the world that we're just not watching right now that are really taking advantage of this situation that we're going to be talking about? Maybe it's climate change, which you've talked about, which just, no one cares now because, you've got a more immediate problem, or maybe it's, something else. But what are the things we're taking our eye off the ball that we may be talking about?
There's a few things. Climate we've mentioned, Hong Kong we've mentioned. North Korea is expanding its nuclear and missile inventories. Iran is going farther and farther beyond the limits of the 2015 agreement. Maduro is, I think, essentially dug in and has prevailed in Venezuela. Assad has dug in Syria. You've got complete mayhem in places like Libya, still in Yemen. Russia is, if I can see Putin, zero changed in what he's doing in Ukraine. You had the problems along the India-Chinese border. So it's, we may not have the bandwidth. It's a little bit, just because we're not paying attention doesn't mean it's not happening. So I think, again, other than Europe, I'm hard pressed to think about other things that have gotten better.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
sorry.
So before, obviously we've sort of talked about some of the things that have gone wrong in the last 4 years and this sense of pullback. And I want to talk about, some of the dialogue, and how you even maintain dialogue. But before we move to that, is there anything to be learned? And I ask this question delicately, is there anything to be learned from, Trump's foreign policy? Was there for example, I'll throw something out, is there some idea that America sort of had more power than it was exercising? And when you think about, an ability to maybe, for example, the assassination of Soleimani, and this moment where you had a person who was, seemed to be a terrorist mastermind, where U.S. power was deployed in a way we don't normally deploy it. I'm not saying whether it was wrong or right, but it was deployed in a way we don't normally deploy it outside of war, and killed someone who seemed to be doing very bad things. Had Americans' blood on his hands, and had we not been using American power to the full extent, and is maybe there a lesson to be learned about the strength of American power and how far it could reach?
Well, it's too soon, I think, on that one to weigh the implications of what we did. I put that in the too soon. I think Trump gets some credit for challenging the prevailing wisdom on China. I think he gets some points for providing defensive arms to Ukraine, something the Obama administration wouldn't do. I think the fact that he renegotiated NAFTA, not didn't transform it as he brags, but he got an agreement, and he actually got bipartisan support in the Congress for it. Pretty good. So I think there's some things, going around where, on balance, though, I think the world is in worse shape today than it was when he took office. And I think there's greater questions about American behavior and reliability. And so again, I think one can find some areas where you go, okay, well, that actually might have been welcome. But I think overall the pattern will be to very much contribute to the centrifugal forces, in part because in many cases, he stopped supporting, the World Health Organization is a perfect example. It was repeal, almost like healthcare, but there's no replace. It would have been one thing if he said on the World Health Organization, look, it clearly is flawed for the following 6 reasons. We've begun consultations with our allies. We're going to propose collectively a set of amendments to improve it. If we can do it, great. If we not, we're going to create a rival mechanism, alternative mechanism. That'd be, okay, that's called foreign policy. I get that. To simply take our soccer ball and leave the field, I don't see how that helps. And in too many areas, that to me has been, the reaction to what you might call an imperfect inheritance, which you began with. My last book was called The World in Disarray. Yeah. And my argument was that whoever was the 45th president was going to begin with a world that was, again, heading in the wrong direction, going to be difficult.
Yeah.
And so I think it's fair to say inherited. My point is simply he's going to, if win or lose, whoever in the Oval Office come late January of next year is going to have a world in a hell of a lot more disarray than the world was 4 years before.
So let's talk a little bit about, not how we fix the institutions, but how we fix the conversation and, the level of trust. And, and this seems to be a particularly intractable problem right now. But, and you've got a few questions on this one from sort of Dorit about, you talk about, watching the nightly news and how politicized and polarized, sort of every point of view is, right? Right. And, so I guess there's sort of twofold questions of what do you, how do you think about or get your news? But I guess you're an experienced reader of these things, or how would you recommend, that people kind of get their news in a way that depoliticizes the conversation, or is it intractable?
It's hard to depoliticize it. So I think the best thing you can do is get is not be one source. Mm-hmm. Think of it as an intellectual supply chain. You don't want to put all your sourcing in one basket. So you don't just want to watch Fox. You don't just want to watch MSNBC. You don't just want to read one paper. So my view is essentially get a bit of variety. There's enough quality out there. In newspapers, I'm crazy. I read a lot, but there's the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. I have to read the New York Post because of local sports and politics and Page 6. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there. There's certain television or radio things, or there's quality out there. Certain websites are really good. So I think the main thing is to find, The Economist, I think, is an important weekly read. So I think but in some ways you protect yourself with a little bit of variety rather than single sourcing where you get your news from.
How much, how much do we kind of discount, whether it's discounting, Trump's tweets or the things Kim Jong-un says, or in this area where you now have political leaders sort of jumping into the fray, not all of them, right, and saying things that seem not particularly statesmanlike in the classic sense of statesmanlike. Do we, how do we as kind of readers discount what's being said and what's being meant? But also, interestingly, how seriously do other leaders take it when Trump tweets something, or the sort of the president of Iran says something very extreme? How serious?
They take it seriously. I basically tell people to deal with Trump's tweets in many ways as we used to deal with White House statements. Mm-hmm. This is his attempt to go over the heads of the media and to basically communicate directly to he cares most about the American public, but also the world without a filter. He doesn't want others to package it. So I take it seriously. Plus, he or any leader, when you say stuff out there, you're broadcasting, which is another way of saying a lot of people see it. You're going to be held accountable for it, and you can, if you contradict it, you're not going to get away with it in the sense that people aren't going to notice. 50 years ago or 75 years ago, you had the concept of the smoke-filled room. And leaders could say one thing to one audience or constituency and something else to another audience and constituency. Can't do that anymore. Well, out there, it's out there. So I take it seriously because leaders can create expectations, can get trapped in some ways with their own rhetoric. So for take North Korea, the president talks about all he's doing with this, denuclearization. Well, guess what? That's our policy. And so at first, people weren't sure around the world what to make of it because it's so non-traditional. But like it or not, I think people around the world now read these things as revealing. And again, they can constrain what leaders can say or do down the road because they've created markers domestically and internationally. So I think people should take them seriously.
So, one thing that we talk about a lot is public service. And I think, and you were sort of an individual that, gave a lot of your life to public service. How, do you think about maybe, a tradition of public service, or when you look at countries around the world that have a tradition of public service versus those that don't? It feels very much like you had a moment in the 60s, when the best and brightest would want to go and work in the government, right? And now it often feels like government is on both sides of the aisle sort of denigrated, and is something, this is all left for other people to do and worry about, and I've got to, do my thing. And so could a renewal of the tradition of public service be some way to bring together, even when you think about the military in times of war, when you've had, people serve in the military, or do you see that in other countries, models of other countries that work?
I mean, look, the short answer is, well, maybe not so short answer. I'm a great believer in public service. And also, by the way, at its best, there's nothing more satisfying, interesting, challenging. It's fantastic. When I worked, you mentioned Bush 41. Those 4 years were as good as it gets. I remember one day sitting with Brent Scowcroft and Bob Gates. We were all on the National Security Council. And Bob just turned to the two of us and said, "You realize it's never going to get better than this." And the three of us, and we kind of knew it then, and he was right. It was just, so I encourage young people to do it. And you can have an impact on issues of real import. I'll be honest with you. I hate the pejorative stuff about deep state and all that. Look, these are people who are dedicating their lives, their careers to work, and they're not, not a lot of stock options when you work for the United States government. Nobody gets rich there. So I think it's worthy stuff. We want the best people to go, if not for a career, then for a stint.
Right.
I think we're actually entering a period. I'm glad you asked me this. I think we're entering a period, though, where the cycle may turn a little bit, because it's been very negative, denigrating it and so forth. My guess is, and we're beginning to see it in Congress, and it's beginning to be bipartisan, I think we're entering an era of American history where the role of government is going to grow. We're seeing it because of the pandemic. We're seeing it, though, because of the social safety net. I think we're going to see it in the economy. My guess is the role of government is going to grow. And I think you will see as a result, and even Biden talked about it yesterday, today, we're going to talk about areas of increased self-sufficiency. So we're not as supply chain dependent or import dependent. We're going to see the growth of the government directed or financed production and so on. I think one of the things that also could happen is we could see a revival of support for some version of national service. Because also, if we have millions of unemployed, It might be a way of helping to transition through this. And it could be a way of reskilling a lot of younger people who don't have the skills they need, or not even reskilling, just skilling, because many of them have never been skilled in the first place, have never had access to practical education. So my guess is, can't prove it, but my gut tells me we're probably entering a period where there'll be more talk of national service and probably more civilian domestic. I don't know if it's going to be on the scale of the WPA, kind of going back to the 30s, but I do think there's going to be, with hospital workers and census takers and contact tracers and teachers and infrastructure. So my guess is there's going to be a larger civilian component of national service alongside the military, which, by the way, is in some ways is our most successful institution in America.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I actually think it's a great idea to have, even maybe universal national service, right? Which is kind of almost like what you had during that moment in World War II, but it was part of the military. But it doesn't need to, it doesn't be part of the military. I mean,
you don't want it. We don't need a lot more manpower in the military. So you don't want it as part of the military, and it's not efficient. Given you want people to be in the military for longer, given the upfront costs of training. So I actually think there's a good match now. You got a lot of young people who are unemployed and underskilled. We've got large domestic needs. I think this may be an idea whose time is coming. You got to get the details right, but I think this is an intriguing area. And one other thing, this is such a divided society. The idea that you would begin to have some shared experience across class, gender, racial, religious, geographic, you name it, lines, I think would be a really healthy thing for this thing we call the United States of America. So I actually hope it happens.
Right. Someone, one person asked about this concept that people talk about, and I do think about it as we talk about national service, and some of the better moments in American history of American exceptionalism. And, is that concept still relevant today? And, how far and, to what extent are we, still a model? Obviously,
not much.
Can be, and we aspire to be, but
the answer is not much. I mean, even before COVID-19, we had 30,000 gun deaths a year, 60,000 or so opioid deaths a year, large inequality, terrible infrastructure, too much poor primary education. No, we still have wonderful things. Best universities in the world, rule of law, a lot of things that are positive. Don't get me wrong. Innovation culture, Silicon Valley, I get it. But I think the appeal of the American model had largely faded. I think COVID-19 will make a real dent in it. The inept response. I mean, it's the question now. American exceptionalism has actually become derisive. The term, because we've got 3 million people who have been tested positive, 130,000+ deaths. We're exceptional in how badly things are going, and needless to say, we haven't bottomed out. Would I love to get back to the point where the phrase was once again said with respect? Absolutely. Could we get back there? Absolutely. But we're not there now. And I think you got to be honest before you can fix something. The analysis has got to be right. And I also think, I take even the issue of race. If we can deal with our racial issues in this country, then it's fantastic. Because then it shows that we identified a problem, dealt with it, reformed. So civil rights can be a wonderful example of how a democracy can deal with its own flaws. On the other hand, if we can't, and it leads just to more violence, and we don't root out racism and the rest, then it really detracts from our reputation and our standing in the world. So I think it just depends on how we deal with our imperfections.
Yeah. Who in the world do you see as models right now in terms of leadership? I mean, you mentioned, Germany and France maybe, but because sometimes you wonder whether we get judged on a different scale from everybody else, right? And it's because of that history. But I'm curious, as you look around the world, I mean, certainly, we said China's not a model. There's a lot of sort of authoritarian, places that prosper. But who's a model that is also doing well, and or sort of rising from, and getting better as a government? Or is this a generalized problem around the world?
I think it's generalized. I think the combination of a lot of authoritarians, a lot of nationalism, a lot of populism. There's not a lot out there that I find admirable. I can't tell you. So there's some, some people would say, well, Merkel this or is good, or Taiwan has done well dealing with COVID. Same with New Zealand. Germany's done well. I mean, you could look at certain things, but by and large, this is not an era of impressive public sector leadership, whether in this country or around the world. So no, this is it's real. I grant that it's a difficult era, but I don't see people who will ever have the words "great" associated with them. And I'm sad to say, I'd love to be proven wrong. I'm wrong all the time, but I just don't think this is. And I'm not talking about heroic leadership. I'm talking about competent leadership and smart leadership, and that ought to be. I don't expect Churchill's to come. Churchill is a once a century figure if you're lucky.
Yeah.
FDR was an extraordinary figure. Lincoln was an extraordinary figure. But I'm not talking about that. I mean, we were talking before about Bush 41. That to me was someone who was extremely competent, decent, left the world and the country in a better place than he found. That to me is an achievable standard. People who walked into situations and left them better off than they found them. I can go around the world and talk about people in my lifetime. There's the Mandelas, the clerks, Rabin in the Middle East. There are people who I think, but at the moment, I do not find this. I don't see this as one of those moments where I can go around the world and say, here's 10 or 20 leaders who I would say would be great at any, or would be really
right.
You'd want to have at any moment in history. I just don't see that. I don't see that, right? Which probably explains, by the way, why the world is in the shape it's in. This isn't the moment. And the only good news, sorry to go on so long, is I think the status quo, leaders right now could find themselves under real pressure if they don't perform. And so if you're a populist in power and you don't perform, like a Bolsonaro, to some extent like Donald Trump, then you could be held accountable for it. So populism is not a permanent situation, or authoritarians like a Xi Jinping. By the time you've consolidated all that power, if you don't deliver, you're potentially politically vulnerable. So we'll see how things play out. But so this is not a permanent. This is just where we are right now. But at the moment, I don't think history will be kind to most of the leaders in the world.
How much do you think this decline in respect for experience or, kind of know-how, very specific know-how, which we see as it relates to science and in other areas, sort of prevents that kind of leader that you talk about from emerging? HW is the Bush 41 is a great example. And we were talking about the fact that, he not only oversaw the intervention in the Middle East successfully, he oversaw the decline of, the end of the Cold War, basically without a hitch. But, he came out of a tradition of yes, public service, but, it was a moment where you still had respect for,
Sure.
authority and know-how. Could or is it just that the leaders are not inspiring enough? And when you find an inspiring leader, then, or is there,
Well, again, I think it's tough because of social media.
Yeah.
And everybody's got a microphone now. On the other hand, I see leaders with pretty high popularity ratings, and people have gone up, like a Merkel, like Tsai in Taiwan, Prime Minister of New Zealand, when they perform well.
Yeah.
So I think there's still a degree of responsiveness. The other thing I'd say is, and there was one of 41's failings, it's not enough to do the right thing as a leader. You've also got to explain as you go along. I think you've got to educate. Whenever I talk to people who want to be president or whatever, or after they are, I try to talk about the power of the Oval Office as a classroom. And in
Mhm.
some ways, the president who did it best was before my lifetime was FDR with the fireside chats, but we've had other good communicators, JFK, Reagan, and so forth. But I think you've got to explain because you're going to have a lot of headwinds where
Yeah.
people aren't going to understand why you're doing or going to disagree with. They're going to read something on the internet that's going to say this or that. And I think you can't take anything for granted anymore.
Mhm.
I think you've got to invest the time as a leader, much more like in companies. Same thing. And look, I don't know how I've learned a lot in the last 4 months we've been on remote. You know, I got a small business. I've got 400 employees, if you will, and I've got 5,000 members of the council, another 150 corporate members. I've had to spend far, far, far more time explaining
Mhm.
rather than and what the remote reality has done is it's forced me, it's brought home the lesson. It's not enough just to do good stuff. You've
Mhm.
got to explain yourself into and listen a lot more and talk a lot more
Yeah.
and rather than just do. And that's been a real, and I think that's true in general though of our lives, whether you're a corporate leader, an NGO leader, or a political leader, that you've got to explain and educate and have much more of a dialogue with the people you're working with and the rest than was the case before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a great lesson at every level. But sort of last question, because we're out of time. This book was directed at everyone, but I would venture to say particularly at the young. And that's the story you told at the beginning that inspired the idea. And as we think about this moment, it does feel like we've had this decline you've described, and as we try to think about setting the conditions to begin to build things back and make things better, what are, other than reading the book and being better informed, how would you think about educating the young and changing our educational ways of educating educational institutions,
Yeah. Let me say
community
one thing.
in a different way?
If I could do one thing, if I had a magic wand, uh, for both high schools and colleges, I'll talk about the United States for a second. I would want there to be certain things that every high school graduate and every college graduate was exposed to. So in high school, besides critical thinking and reading and writing and math and maybe computer skills or whatever, I would want every young person to be exposed to a course on civics about the political inheritance and DNA of this country, and
Mhm.
every young person to be exposed to the basics about the world. Same thing on college. Essentially, I'd want to have national standards and I'd want to have a pressure on universities to educate their students so they understood the democracy and they understood the world they were going to become full participants in. So I would actually, I want education. I mean, I'm a great believer in a liberal arts education, but I want education to start saying, this is what we think you need to know. I
Yeah.
want educational authorities to act with greater authority. And if it means in some cases that you go, well, I disagree, that's not the school for me, then I want them to say Godspeed, then you should go to that other school. But I think there's an unwillingness to say, this is what we think an educated young person needs to have under his or her belt. And I would like to see a competition in this country and a movement, certainly at the high school level towards national standards, and at the college and university level, greater competition for what we think an education ought to consist of.
Mhm. Well, let's leave it there. I think it's absolutely correct, and couldn't agree with you more. But Richard, thank you for joining us today. This was a lot of fun for me. I think it was really fun and enjoyable for the team around the world, and really appreciate your joining us. Hope everybody enjoys the book.
Thank you, David.